I don't know that we can get either one of those landowners to do it. It is on the Register of Texas History in the county clerk's office about that, and got them to agree. They agreed that they would move them back, and now they're housed, I think, in the archives there for the Historical Commission. And Victor Smith and I worked on getting them all. They got them all straightened up in their filing cabinets. They're crumbling, so you have to be very careful and need to wear gloves when you really handle them, because they're just falling apart. But they do carry a lot of the early school records for Hood County that date back to about the 1880s. So they're important records. But I've got school records on Rock Church all the way back to the 1860s.
Oh gosh.
So there's a lot there.
Yeah.
That I have been working on and trying to put it all together so we'll have it in a cohesive order where we can go year by year and can tell which settlers were there when, especially since the 1890 census burned, and there's a gap between 1880 and 2000. I mean, 1880 and 1900. There was a good bit of migration through the county at that time, and they went on further west or went back east or to the cities. So anyway, I've been trying to work on a lot of that with the people that were there in that community. But let me tell you what my mission has been, and I just took it upon myself to do this. You know, I fought with the group, the Paluxy Dinosaur Valley Association group, to see that they did not dam up the Paluxy River. And we battled against this city of Stephenville, Erath County, and Somerville County. At one time, Granbury was involved in it, and our Hood County, and then they backed out of it because they found it was illegal for them to do a study on it over a certain dollar amount, and it was going to cost more money than that. And at the time, the judge decided to get out of the whole project. We went with a whole lot of our family when we kind of kept our eye on it, and I was working in Dallas for Continental Telephone as an economic forecaster. So my job was to get out all over the state of Texas and do rural surveys on telephone installations that we were responsible for, and project what we were going to need in the future as far as cable and equipment. And so we did a forecast, you know, for the future needs. And so I went to work at Contel, or Continental Telephone of Texas at the time, in 1970. And that was just as they were kicking off the construction of the nuclear plant at Glen Rose. So I knew that we had family cemeteries, and I looked at the projects of what they were going to do. And when they announced in the 1980s that they were going to build a dam across the Paluxy River, my mother saw it in the paper and showed it to me, and I go, oh dear, you know, we've got all our family history down there in the middle of that river bottom. So I started looking at it while I worked for the phone company, and I thought, we as a family are going to have to do something. So I made contact with several family members at that time, but I didn't get much response back. Well, the city of Stephenville and the Water Commission, commissioner, Ralph Roming, one of the water commissioners for the state of Texas at the time, and the lawyer for the city of Stephenville, and Judge George Crump, who was county judge for Somerville County at that time, decided that they would have a little meeting, and Mr. Roming, Commissioner Roming, had come out with an edict. First, they said that the water would not hold in that lake if they built it because it was an aquifer. And so they also decided, for some reason, I can't remember now all of it, but I have the records at home, that they would deny the permit. the water permit for the dam. And so, anyway, it had been introduced in the legislature with a bill that would have allowed them to do oil well flooding, coal mining, all kinds of industrial stuff around that lake. And about the time that they decided to do that lake, they were having trouble getting permitted for the nuclear plant. So anyway, first Roaming, decides that it isn't a good project, or the three water commissioners did. And then Roaming has a meeting with the city of Stephenville, the lawyer for the city of Stephenville, and I don't know if Crump was there that day, but I do know that the water commissioner was. And it was at the Austin Club. And so anyway, they were overheard at lunch cutting a deal under the table that Ralph Roaming was a Democrat, and Bill Clements was just going in as governor, okay? But they cut a deal, the lawyer did, that they would go, to the governor and try to get him reappointed, even though he was a Democrat in a Republican administration. So they made the deal under the table. I don't know if any money changed hands or not, but they were overheard. Well, the people that overheard it knew about our lawsuit that we had filed against it. And so anyway, they came and told our lawyer about it, and so then we started looking for details of what had happened. And anyway, in the meantime, I had read it in the newspaper that Ralph Roaming had denied that permit first, and then he came back and changed it so that they could build a lake. And so I began to really worry about it. So I called some of the people. There was an article in the Star-Telegram saying that they were going to try to fight it, the people of Paluxy. So I made some calls and went and met with them and talked to them, and I said, look, I'll help in any way I can, because there were 3 of my great-great-grandfathers that are buried in that Paluxy River Valley. One of them in Brooks Cemetery would be totally inundated. Rock Church would be endangered, and I don't know how many more others that are there that, that might do it. But I would like to help, and my husband and I will do the public relations on it and try to help as much as we can. And so we got involved in it, and the more we got involved, we decided that we really needed to contact the families in those old cemeteries to let them know what was going to happen, because they would, at the time that they would go ahead and build the dam, the Corps of Engineers would have to either move the cemetery and abate it, or they would have to flood it. But they needed the family members to come up and stand up and say, no, this is what you need to do with Grandpa when you move his grave. So anyway, we were concerned about all that, so we fought it, and then we finally decided we'd contact the families. So we decided to have a family reunion, and we started those back in the late 1980s, and we had several family reunions and got acquainted with family and told them what was going on. And then the Save the Paluxy group had sort of loosely organized, and we decided that we would try to try to fight it as long as we could. So, but we needed funds for our lawyers. So that was when we started having the picnics at Paluxy, and we did that for 10 years. From about April through October, we would have a picnic once a month, and a fish fry is what it amounted to. And we would have people come in by bus loads. Eventually, word got around from Fort Worth and Dallas, and all of them would join us, and we raised enough money to keep our lawyer afloat. And anyway, we kept fighting it, and in 1997, it was thrown out of the Texas Supreme Court. And the way those permits are done in water at the water board at that time. It was the first one, in time that had been filed, was the first in line, and they just went from there. Well, ours, what had happened, if ours got turned down, or the dam permit got turned down, it meant they had to go to the back of the line and start all over again. And so, anyway, it was remanded back to the Texas Court of Appeals, and there the court decided that they would not, the court decided after the judge heard it in Austin, that the permit needed to be denied. Then they appealed it. The appeal court then carried it on. The Texas Supreme Court, the Supreme Court refused to hear it, went back to the appeals court, and anyway, the ruling stood that the permit was denied. And so in 1997, that was what happened. And so we had all of our people at Paluxy, when we had gathered together. One of the little catchwords at Paluxy is that at one time it was known as pull tight, because of the tight pull when they would go to the mill to have their corn or flour ground. They would have to pull up out of that river bottom and go up the hills to go to wherever they were going. And so it got the nickname of pull tight, because you had to pull really tight to get up out of that, across that river. Well, anyway, we sat down together at Paluxy with family and friends and old residents and people that were going to lose their land. And we just decided we would pull tight as a community, and we would stand firm, and we would fight that, and we won. And that's, something we've not crowed about. We haven't said very much about it, but it did stop the water project at that time. That doesn't mean in the future it won't come back up, but at this time, the Texas Parks and Wildlife stood with us because it endangered Dinosaur Valley State Park and dinosaur tracks all up and down that river. Plus, there were 7 family cemeteries that were involved after we did a census and found all of them. And while we were working on all that, I started researching the properties that were going to be inundated and how they related to the history of Hood County. And so, over the years, those properties changed hands with different family members, or they sold or whatever. But anyway, I did that through that river bottom and got a really good idea of the early settlers and the people that were there, and that moved on or died or were buried there. So that was how I got my interest and got started in all of it. My grandmother was from Paluxy, my mother's mother, and my grandfather, my mother's father, was from Rock Church. So I had, a leg in each community and a lot of family ties. And as we were researching all of that, I found, my goodness, I can't tell you how many cousins I have up and down that river now. And I decided a long time ago, if you throw a rock on the Paluxy River anywhere towards a person, you're going to probably hit a cousin of mine, or you're going to hit a piece of property that belonged to one of them. So, you want to just kind of be careful what you say down there, because you're related. Right. So, anyway, over the years, we disbanded the fish fries after we won the lawsuit, and but anyway, we became a very close-knit community, and a closer-knit community because of all that. And we worked with trying to get the people at Paluxy to restore, or at least help stabilize the old rock building at Paluxy that was built by my great-great-grandfather, William Etheridge. And it was owned by the one family who were cousins who had purchased it from my great-great-grandmother when she was elderly and had passed away. It was actually in her estate that Ben purchased it. And so he purchased up some other lands there that at one time had been owned by Grandpa Meek. But anyway, to start back at the beginning of the history of Paluxy, we have to go all the way back to the 1850s. in the early 1860s to get a really early glimpse of what happened there. And the old mill was under construction and built and completed in 1859. And it was a grist mill. It ground corn and grain for flour and cornmeal. And it had several owners, but the first man who built it was a Mr. Hugh Gocher. And Mr. Gocher is spelled Gotcher, and a Mr. Havens did the work on it. And my grandfather Meek had come from Tennessee in 1846 after Texas became a state. He migrated to Gilmer County, Texas, near Upshur County, near Gilmer, Texas. Then he came across, there was a land grant that was given called Peters Colony, and it came east and it took in part of Hood County. And he migrated over to a little community called Sugar Hill. And there was a gentleman that owned a little general store there. And his father, who was kind of a witch doctor, whatever. Father, I think it was his father-in-law, Mr. Jones. But anyway, Grandpa bought some land there. He bought the Lemuel Blanton survey of land in Collin County and near Sugar Hill. Well, Sugar Hill today is known as Farmersville, Texas.
Okay.
But anyway, the captain that owned the store in Sugar Hill was killed along about, I think, 1854-55 in a dispute at Christmas because it was Christmas Eve and he closed the store and some people wanted in and wanted liquor and he wouldn't sell it to them, and so they shot him and killed him. So anyway, Grandpa was there during that time. His first wife, Mahala Tidwell, and the Tidwell family go all the way back to Normandy and came over with during the reign of or during the battle with the Normans and the English. Anyway, Mahala is descended from that line, and Mahala Tidwell and John had several children, and anyway, she was pregnant again when they lived there in Sugar Hill, and she caught pneumonia or respiratory illness or something. Well, the old Dr. Jones decided that he needed to help her get rid of the child that she was carrying, and anyway, he evidently ruptured something and she bled to death. And so my grandmother, Mahala Tidwell, was buried there, which is a terrible, terrible story. Broke my heart when I found out about it, and everybody that hears it. But, and she left 10 children that were still living. Grandpa, within about a year or so, married a woman, a Mrs. Freeman, Sarah Elizabeth Freeman, and she was younger than his two oldest daughters, and family was
happened a lot.
The family was mortified. But anyway, he needed a cook and she needed a husband, and so she was young, but he had 2 children by her. And so he decided he would come, he was looking at land further west. The 2 oldest daughters had married Ben Arp and Eustace Brooks. Ben and Arlena had married in Upshur County, I think, and then Eustace and Rachel Meek Brooks married near Farmersville. And my grandmother, great-great-grandmother, Maggie Etheridge, married a Mr. Day there, or Maggie Meek, and then she became an Etheridge after Mr. Day died. Anyway, homestead land in Peters Colony over in Wise County. So Grandpa decides he wants to look over at land and maybe go on further down into Erath County. And so he leaves. Sarah Elizabeth was pregnant with his second child, and she was making him a suit of clothes. And anyway, he wanted her to finish that before he made a trip with part of their belongings down. He decided to go down to Erath County. Well, she didn't finish the clothes. He went on the trip. She had the baby a little bit early, and he went on and left. And anyway, she died 9 days after that baby was born. This was his second wife. So we have two of his wives buried in Collin County.
Did the baby survive?
No. No, yes, she did. Sarah Elizabeth, yes, she did. His second wife's second child, Sarah Elizabeth Meek King. She married a king. Anyway, she survived during that, during all of that. Grandpa had purchased a slave lady, Emily, when he came to Texas to help with the children, and her son, Henry. And when they were freed in 1865 by the Civil War, they took on the family name of Meek. But anyway, Emily raised Grandpa's other children pretty much after Sarah Elizabeth died. And he came on and moved down into Erath County, served as county clerk in Erath County. He was a constable, I believe, in Collin County. When he came down to Erath County, he was the county clerk there. He'd been a constable in Collin County. Anyway, he served during the Civil War, and there's several muster rolls that people were enlisted that have his name on it from the Civil War. I have copies from the state archives. But anyway, then while he was there, serving as county clerk, he found the land out on the Paluxy, and it was the Samuel McGowan survey, and he decided to purchase it. Now, he had known Mr. Hugh Gocher when he was at Sugar Hill. The Gochers live there, and there's still Gocher family in Collin County. But I don't know if he had Mr. Gocher start that mill, or if he knew Mr. Gocher had bought it and he decided to buy land around it. That's still, you know, kind of up in the air as to which started first. But he became an owner of that mill, and along with a Mr. Dan Hemmons. And he built a cabin out right on the mouth of Richardson Creek, where it flows into the Paluxy. And if you go out Baker's Crossing Road today and you cross at Baker's Crossing where the water comes under the road and then it goes over at flood stage, his land would be, if you were going east, his land would be on the right just after you cross that river, the Paluxy River. But anyway, he built a double pen log cabin with a dog trot between it out there, and out of walnut logs. And he moved out there, and he some way acquired, I don't know whether he purchased it from Mr. Gocher, or Mr. Gocher was in cahoots with him to build the mill, but anyway, he owned part of the mill. And he sold half interest of it, or the other half interest of the mill was owned by Mr. Dan Hemmons. Now, Dan is a very, very interesting character that we need to really write some stories about, because he was from England, from the Isle of Wight, W-I-G-H-T. And he came here to Hood County, and he found that he fell in love with a daughter of Andy Walters. Now, Andy Walters is part of the Aston family. The Aston family married, or Mr. Aston married into the Walters family, but Mr. Walters had several daughters. Well, Dan fell in love with one of his daughters and wanted to marry her. And he was kind of an adventurer, so he had come from England and was kind of looking through the country and everything. And he decided he wanted to settle down and buy that mill. So he made a trip all the way back to England to see his father and ask his father for his part of his inheritance. And he came back and purchased that mill with that inheritance.
So is he related to the Aston that built this house?
Yes, the Astons, Andy Aston, that is part of that family.
Family?
Yeah. There were several. Prestige is another family name that married into Andy's family. Mr. Haley, James Haley married into that family, married another daughter. Now, Andy was involved. He lived, his land was out closer to Comanche Peak. Now, I'm talking, this is 1860s, late 1850s, early 1860s, that he came here. And I've traced the Walters family back to Texas in Cherokee County is where I first encountered them. And the Astons were there, and the Prestiges, and there was a couple other family names that were all there at that time and intermarried. And they all migrated this way, or portions of their family. They may have left some, still there, but they basically migrated out this way as Texas was expanding. So they were very early settlers. They moved on, and so there's still some of the Walters family around, and there's still some of the Aston family around. But anyway, Dan marries into the Walters family. He comes back from England and marries her. I found their marriage records in that little book that was preserved when the courthouse burned down that has just a few marriages in it, very early marriages in the 1860s. I found his marriage record in that book. And so anyway, they lived there at Paluxy, and they had a daughter, and then they owned the mill for a good little portion of time. Grandpa sells his portion out to James Haley, who is a brother-in-law of Mr. Hemmons, and married another daughter of Andy Walters. Andy Walters and Grandpa Meek and Isaac Cow and several others who were very, very early settlers into Hood County were all involved in the fight as to where they were going to place the courthouse. And Grandpa Meek was one of the first 3 commissioners that was appointed to locate the county seat. And some of the families wanted it closer to Comanche Peak and more in the Johnson County side, and some of them wanted it at a different area. And then finally the Nutt brothers, after there was another commission, they had votes and they couldn't decide, so another commission group of commissioners, and Isaac Cow was in the second group of commissioners, were appointed, and that's when the Nutt brothers gave the land and everything. But now this is early Hood County history that I picked up in bits and pieces in 1,000 different places. It's not written down anywhere. So, and I've put it together with relationships by finding out some of this. Anyway, Mr. Haley purchases the mill along about the late 1860s, and like 1869, 70, something like that. And he and Mr. Hemmons are partners then until sometime in the 1870s. And Andy Walters and Dan Hemmons and a couple of Andy's sons, and I think one of the Astons, the main Aston family stayed here, but I think one of the sons of the Aston family, all went out to Coleman County, to a community called Trickham, and they decided that they would live out there and raise cattle, and there was a main cattle drive that came through that area. Well, they died there and they're buried there. And Mr. Hemmons, after he passed away out there, his widow came back and she sold that mill property and other land that Mr. Hemmons had owned. Well, Grandpa Meek had bought part of it. By that time, Grandpa Etheridge, who had served in the Civil War and lived in Missouri, he had come down after the Civil War. He had a wagon with a load of bushels of apples, bushel baskets of apples, a barrel of whiskey, and his son, because his wife and him had divorced after the Civil War, she went back. They had come down to Cook County, Texas, to escape the Civil War if they could. Now, Grandpa Etheridge had served out of Missouri as a soldier in the expedition that went out to the Mormon War in the late 1850s. and they put down the Mormon War, or they negotiated it out, is what finally happened, I think. But he had served in that under Albert Sidney Johnson, who was a famous general in the Civil War, but this was, way prior to the Civil War. And what happened out there, the Mormons had burned a lot of the land, knowing this army was coming, and had burned off the land, and there was no forage for the horses or the cattle that they brought along with this group of soldiers. And so they got stuck in a bad snowstorm out in Wyoming and nearly froze to death. And the horses and the men were starving. And so I think they negotiated a peace and came back. But Grandpa Etheridge didn't want any more war after living through that. And he had enlisted when he was like 17 or 18 years old. So he had married, and he decided he would come to Texas, and they came to Preston on the Red River. Now Preston was an early community there that was at a crossing on the river that it no longer exists. It's under Lake Texoma now. But anyway, Preston, Old Preston was a very historic crossing where people would come from the Missouri, Oklahoma area and down, and Illinois and down through Texas. So he comes with his wife's father, and his wife's grandfather lived in that Old Preston area. And so they come down and are trying to escape the Civil War. There's a battle between the Indians and some who were fighting for the Confederacy and the Union forces as they cross Oklahoma, and they're very close to it, and they observe can observe what's going on. He writes a little story about it. Well, he gets on down into Choctaw country, and his wife is pregnant with his first child, and so his wife delivers a baby there, and an old Choctaw Indian had come and helped her do it. Well, anyway, it took the last of his money, I think, to pay the Indian doctor. And then he built fence to earn enough money to come on down and pay the ferry fee to get across the Red River to Preston. And so they live there, and they get there just in time for the Great Hanging. Now, the Great Hanging in Texas took place as the Civil War was, just starting. And the Confederate sympathizers were not going to tolerate any Union forces to come into the state of Texas, and they were going to protect their border, is what it amounted to. Anyway, there was a terrible tragedy that Jim Borland, who was a colonel in the Confederacy in the Texas Army too, they start having people who, if they're even mention a word about the United States or had any sympathy towards the Union remaining together, they would gather that family or that man, and they were hung, and there were 40 of them that were hung. Well, Grandpa Etheridge, coming into that, he decided he would join the Confederacy. Yeah, right. Under Jim Borland, okay. So he serves in the Civil War to keep from being hung, is what I always say. Anyway, his father, Grandpa Etheridge's father, Jared Etheridge, also was in the Confederacy, and he was in a battle in Arkansas, I believe, or Missouri, and he was captured, and he died in the Rock Island prison camp up on the Mississippi River, Rock Island, Illinois. He died in April, just as General Lee was surrendering. And what had happened, the quartermaster in Rock Island was using the money to line his own pockets, and a lot of the men starved to death or died from dysentery and not having enough clothes and warmth and that kind of thing. And he died just previous to the surrender. So he's the next to the last Confederate buried in the Confederate cemetery on Rock Island, Illinois. But anyway, Grandpa Etheridge, you know, he knew his father's leanings, and I guess he decided he would be better off to not get hung, and he'd just go with that, the flow. He served until the end of the Civil War under that regiment. Anyway, afterwards he was pretty disgruntled, and he came back, and his wife was disgruntled, and they had a daughter in the meantime, and or had a daughter along about that time, and so she decides to go back to Missouri with her father. And she takes the baby and goes back, and Grandpa Etheridge keeps the son, John Harvey Etheridge, with him. And they go back to Tennessee. They get, you know, take a wagon and their belongings, and they go to Skullbone, Tennessee, because that was where the Etheridge family had kind of lived at one time before they went to Missouri. And he decides he can't find anything to satisfy him there. You know, he wasn't happy with living there. So he came back to Missouri, to the distillery at Jolly, Missouri. And he bought that barrel of whiskey and apples from Washershorn Prairie. Now, I don't know where that is in Missouri, but that was where he bought the apples. And he brings that down and pays his way to Texas by selling those apples. Well, as he's coming down into the Paluxy River Valley, he sees all these people camped out at the mill on the river, and they're waiting in line to get their corn ground. It's in the fall of the year, and so he sees an opportunity. So he pulls his wagon up with the rest of them. He breaks out that barrel of whiskey, and he starts selling whiskey by the dipperful. So he was very enterprising, but anyway, he probably got them all just rolling drunk. You know, they had a really good time, probably, like camped out around all that barrel of whiskey. But anyway, he decided to build a little store so he builds a little cabin. It's called when they make the logs like this, it's called a pen. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it's a 1-pen cabin or a 2-pen cabin or a 3-pen cabin. Well, he builds a 1-pen cabin. He doesn't put a roof over it. He puts sheepskin or a tarp of some kind over the top of it. And he says in his little story that he and John Harvey slept on the floor on sheepskins and had that little stock of groceries that he had purchased somewhere. And he began to sell groceries out of that. Well, he met my grandmother Etheridge, who was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Day, had died during the Civil War with measles or some kind of illness. And so anyway, he starts courting Maggie. Maggie's a widow, and she owns some cattle. And so he sees another opportunity. But anyway, they decided they would get married. Well, Grandpa Meek, there was a little store across the river from the mill, a little rock building that was a general store that Grandpa Meek owned. And so he gives that store to Maggie and William Etheridge. And so they run the store for a while. And then Grandpa decides, I think, that he wants to sell the store maybe, and I don't know whether he was going to go into cattle business or what he was going to do, but anyway, he sells it to Luke Jones. Now Luke and Amanda Jones, his wife, had come from Gibson County, Tennessee. And Luke had come down this way after the Civil War, and Amanda was a nurse in the Civil War, and Luke fought in the Civil War. But Amanda had married Mr. Johnson back in Gibson County, Tennessee, and he died during the Civil War. So she was a widow, and Luke married her, and they had 2 children, Leela and Bess Jones. Down, and they bought the old store. They're very small children. And anyway, not long after they moved there, Amanda dies probably from the deprivations during the Civil War, the hard trip down, and hard work after you get on the frontier. So she passes away, and just a year or so after that, Luke passes away. So the 2 children are divided up, and Leela goes with her grandmother up kind of around the Strawn area, and Bess Jones stays with John R. Jones. Well, John R. Jones was one of the four families, members that came in wagon train from Gibson County, Tennessee. And there was Jesse Caraway, and there was William Pate, and there was Isaac Cowan, and there was John R. Jones. And John R. Jones was married to Adeline Caraway, who was Jesse's daughter. Okay, Isaac was married to Mary Polly Branch. Now, Amanda Jones was a Branch before she married a Johnson. So this is her sister that is married to Isaac Cowan. Mr. Pate had married a Jones, one of the sisters of John R. Jones. And Jesse was married to Elizabeth Keithley. And Jesse had lived on land that was owned by Davy Crockett back in Tennessee. And when he and Mr. Pate and Mr. Jones and Mr. Cowan all came here in 1857, they had come from Gibson County, Tennessee, over to the Mississippi River. They rode a steamboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans. They got a steamer in New Orleans and came over to Galveston or somewhere in that area, and disembarked, came up to Hempstead, Texas. They bought horses there, and then they came up all the way up to Mrs. Crockett's place over near Acton to see her, and stayed with her while they went out and looked for land. And they had grown up around the Crockett family, so they were all intertwined and knew them. So anyway, they looked for land. They had located their land in 1857, and out on the Paluxy River where Rock Church area is now. And so then they gone back, and they went back through the Fort Worth, Dallas area and across land back to cross the Mississippi River and over to Gibson County. So they came back that way with their families then in 1859, and that's when they settled out around the Paluxy. And Jesse was right on the Paluxy River where the Rock Church area is now. Mr. Pate had settled down where where Bill and Deesa Jones live now, which is just down Becker's Crossing Road a little ways. Mr. Cowan had settled over on Richardson Creek, which is just about 2.5 miles on further kind of south and west of Rock Church. And Mr. Jones had settled up on what became part of the Nut Ranch and now is owned by the Lawrence family. So anyway, he lived there. Well, Bess and Leela, as they grew up and got grown, during all that time, John R. Jones was their legal guardian. And so he had looked after them, and his mother, who he had brought with him, Dorothy Sutherland from Tennessee. He had Dorothy Sutherland Jones, he had brought all of them with him. So anyway, he looked after them, and during that time, one of his daughters married a Mr. Philip Jackson, who later became a county clerk here in Granbury. Mr. Jackson, they had first, after Luke died, Mr. Jackson ran the store for a while before he became the county clerk, and then there was another part of the Caraway Jackson-Jones relationship that ran the old store at Paluxy. Grandpa had never gotten his money. Grandpa Etheridge had never received the money from the sale of the store. And Leela and Bess, after they got grown, they had never received their inheritance. So they sued John R. Jones for, what is their inheritance, their mother and dad's store. And they win the lawsuit. Well, John R. Jones didn't have the money because he had, used it raising them, and he raised another sister's children, the Longacre family. And so, you know, it was all used up. So he lost his piece of land and it got sold, and I believe one of the Nutt brothers then bought it after that. But anyway, Leela and Best came back, you know, and tried to get their inheritance, and they wanted to marry or go on and, you know, have their own life. Well, Leela marries Coke Hopping, who is part of the Hoppings are part of the Nutt family. And so she marries Coke Hopping, and Bess marries one of the Stokes family that had come with the Wood. They were part of the Wood family that came in 1869 after the Civil War to the Rock Church area. And he goes on out and lives out in West Texas. Leela and Best live around this area, and then they move on out to West Texas and then into New Mexico. And there's a book that Coke Hopping wrote, a sheriff ranger in chuck wagon days, and it tells the story of kind of their life. But anyway, at that time, Grandpa then takes the money that he receives from his Porsche family from the sale of that store, and Grandma takes her cattle and sends them on a trail drive and gets the money from that, and they build the rock store that's still standing today at Paluxy. Okay. So that is how that all came about. In the meantime, Mr. Haley had bought out Mr. Hemmons in the mill, and he ran the mill for probably a good 10 years or so, and then he sold out to Uncle Isaac Moore, who was an early settler at Paluxy, and he also sold out to Mr. Wilson, who had married one of the Jones family. So, and there were several Jones kids.
My own grandpa kind of thing.
Well, I'm not there yet, but I'm going to tell you that later. Anyway, the mill sells to them. Well, they run it for a while, and then when you have a business like the mill, it's seasonal. And you know how seasonal businesses go, because you've been in seasonal businesses and I have too. And so it was just certain times of the year that it really ran. And sometimes it was profitable if they had good crops. If it wasn't, it wasn't profitable. So anyway, during the 1880s and 1886, there was a terrible drought down through Texas. And Aunt Zoni Erickson, one of Meek Brooks' cousins, she writes a letter about how terrible it was and how the cattle died and how children died and how they had to wrap their children in wet clothes or cloths to keep them from dehydrating and dying. And then she talks about finally they got a gully washer of a rain that came, and broke the cycle of drought. But during that time, a lot of cattle died and a lot of other things, and so I'm sure the mill they didn't make any crops, so the mill probably, wasn't doing well either. But anyway, there were ups and downs on that mill. There were many owners after that of that mill every so many years. The Larnard family moves in and they buy into it, and then there are others that buy into it, and the store at Paluxy changes hands several times. But anyway, that's kind of how the beginnings of all that little community started. But before there was a Paluxy and before there was a Rock Church, there was a meeting place that was about halfway in between both settlements. And this was, just as the mill is kicking off, going into business, and settlers are moving into the area. And it is this little community built up. It wasn't really a community, it was a log gathering house, and it was a 2-pen dog dry cabin. And so they would meet there to get their mail, and this was before the stores at Paluxy and the mill. But anyway, William Robinson, who had been a very early missionary and settler and missionary to the Indians and to early settlers in the area, had come through and lived in this part of the country down on the Paluxy. and he was the first postmaster. And they would have, mail would run through, and on mail days, everybody'd come in to get their mail at the little community. So anyway, that was used for that. They used it for a school, and they used it, it was just called the Old Log School, and then they used it for a church, and it was called Bethel Church. Well, during all this time, the settlers from Tennessee and a lot of other areas had, they'd come from pretty good civilization and in Tennessee by that time. And so when they came to Texas and the frontier was raw, and they didn't have finishing schools for little ladies and all of that kind of stuff. Anyway, there would be these itinerant dance teachers that would come through, and they would teach people how to do the different dances. Well, one had come through the community and had taught several of them how to dance, including Mary Cowan Williams, who was a daughter of Isaac and Mary Branch Cowan. And so they decided to have a Saturday night dance for their teenage sister, the two of the brothers, for Mary. And anyway, the dance lasted, to the wee hours of the night. And the next morning was Sunday morning, and here come the people for church that morning. And there's still a lot of evidence of the dance probably hanging out of the trees, and, who knows, with a little moonshine, what might have happened. But anyway, the old pious members of the community were just totally, absolutely outraged. And they just could not, think about having church where they had held that dance. So one of them, probably my great-great-great-grandfather Wood, he was a very staunch Methodist. Mary Cowan says in one of her stories that it was the Methodist that had the loudest voice and complaints about it. So I kind of think he might have been involved. And so anyway, they had an argument about it, and he suggested they take the log floors out of that cabin and turn them over because they had been desecrated by the dance.
Oh gosh.
Well, that didn't happen, but anyway, it got out in the community, and the old legend is that it did, but it didn't, from early stories I found from Mary Cowan Williams. But became a very bitter fight about it. And along about this same time, there was a plague of whooping cough that came through the community. Now, there were a lot of children. The settlers had begun to get stable cabins and, reproduce cattle and kids and a lot of other things. And so there were a lot of children that went to school at the old Vinegar Hill School. Now, the first school down there was under a shade tree, and it was taught by John R. Johns. When they get to the Vinegar Hill level, after the cabin was built, they used that Vinegar Hill, or that cabin, it was called Bethel at the time, and the old log school, they used it to teach, and they had other teachers that came through the area. Anyway, they had this plague of whooping cough, and a bunch of those children died, and the doctor died. He caught it and died, and there was a family, a black family that died in that, and there was one whole family was totally wiped out. I don't know if it was black or white, but it's told in the story that we lost a whole family. Anyway, they were buried in a cemetery there at Bethel. And because of the bitter feelings between the death of the children and the death of, the good feelings in the community about the church, Jesse Caraway decided that he would give the land for Rock Church.
I see.
And so he gives the land for a church, a school, and a Masonic lodge, and a cemetery. And in 1871, there were several that had banded together to become the Paluxy Masonic Lodge. And they decided that the Masons would sponsor the school. And so they decided to go ahead and build, and they hire a contractor I believe out of Waco, Gilpin and Company, to help build the store. Well, the settlers, they gave their time, they gave their what little money they had, and they also donated limestone out of the hillside to a quarry to build the store. Build the old rock building. And it became Rock Church. And they completed about 1873, and in the fall. And so they, hold meetings of the Masonic Lodge and upstairs. And recently I found a deed that Jesse Carraway deeded that whole second floor to the Masonic Lodge. The first floor was deeded to the community to use in any way they wanted to. Along about 1873, there's a Mrs. Brooks who dies, and Jesse carves a rock cairn as a tombstone to cover her grave, and she's the first person buried in the cemetery. And she is the mother of several other Brooks. She's Zachariah Brooks' wife, but several of her sons had come and they had populated land right around that Richardson Creek, Paluxy, and Rock Church area, and not far from where Mr. Cowan had put his homestead. So anyway, she was the first grave, and Jesse made her casket or her covering for her grave, and she was the first grave put there. In the next spring, they hire a teacher out of Missouri, and Mr. James T. Williams, who had gone to college, and I have his certificate from the school, a copy of it, and he is hired as a teacher. And so they bring the school, most of the school people that are up in that area into Rock Church. In the meantime, the old rock building at Bethel, the sour feelings of the community there, everybody started calling it Vinegar Hill, so it's still known as Vinegar Hill, and the name Bethel is forgotten. But, and there's another Bethel in Hood County, by the way.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, there's two.
51.
Yeah. So, but anyway, it became Vinegar Hill. So Grandpa Meek gave some land up on the north side of the Samuel McGowan survey, a little closer to Paluxy, to move that old building, rock building, off of that site, Vinegar Hill site. So they put like a sled, they jack it up and put like a sled or something under it, and they use oxen or horses or whatever, and they pull that building up to Grandpa Meek's land where he gave it. Well, that becomes the school. And the children that were closer to Paluxy went to school there. So they used it, and Coke Hopping mentions it in his book in 1880s, that he and Leila Jones started school the same year in that old school. And there was a Mr. Dunn who was the school teacher. And but anyway, he kind of describes the old building. He said it was old when they went to school there, and the old benches were old log benches, and all. Well, anyway, they have a school there, and then they have the one at Rock Church. Later, the building at the old Vinegar Hill building is abandoned, and they build a little clapboard building at Paluxy, and it's a school there. In the meantime, the mill continues, to operate. And in 1900, when we had the terrible flood, we had a terrible flood on the Paluxy, but that was when a hurricane came into Galveston and brought a lot of rain through the area. But anyway, it kept on operating until about 1908, and we had a terrible cold front that came our Pacific front that came through, that dumped tons of water on Texas and the upper reaches of the Brazos and all through this part of the country. And it brought floodwaters back down the Paluxy. They had, in the meantime, built a bridge across from the mill across to the other side where the store was on the Paluxy to keep from having to ford it there. And the water from that 1908 flood came and caved in. It pushed the bridge from its mooring on the other side, and it caved in the side of the mill, and that destroyed it. It was never rebuilt after that time. So that, and by that time, there was a larger mill built at Barnard's Mill, and then they, when the railroads came through, they brought in flour and things like that, and so it really was obsolete by that time. But anyway, that was kind of the beginnings of that. Mr. Williams, that they hired at Rock Church, he teaches for several years, and Mary Callan Williams is one of his pupils. And she starts going to school there. Well, she falls in love with her teacher, and she finally marries him.
Gosh.
So it becomes the Callan Williams history from then on. She has had a bunch of papers that were preserved in an old trunk, and LaRue Williams Oaks allowed me to copy all of those, and I have Xerox records of all of those Callan papers, and also a good photograph of Isaac Callan that is on a disc that I can share, with someone. I also have been able to find pictures of Jesse Caraway and his wife Elizabeth Keithley, and then I have a ton of pictures at Paluxy from Grandpa Meek and the Meek family reunions that we held, and the Etheridge family, and I've done a lot of research and found a lot more. And people have contributed, many, many things over the years to help us try to find out the history of that. We now have 3 websites. We've restored the old Rock Church because it had really gotten, after the church members disbanded in the 1970s, it had really gone downhill and was really in bad shape. And so we decided as a board that we would try to do something with it. So we started working on it I started talking to them about it back in the 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s. But we finally got across that, it's going to fall down on our ears if we don't do something with it. And so anyway, we decided we would start. And we've been so amazed. The community, I think, we're ready to see it preserved because so much history of that whole valley goes around that old church. And the little clapboard church had been built in 1907. The Rock Church School had gotten large enough at that time that it had taken over most of everything in the downstairs area of that old building. And so one of the members said, well, let's think about building a church just separate, and so they went ahead. The Methodist Church agreed. Jesse had deeded that land to the community under the auspices of the Methodist Church, and everybody, Baptist, Christian, church, or whatever preachers that came through there were welcome to preach. But after 5 years, it was all under the Methodist Church, is the way the deed record read. So the Methodists had been in charge of it from about 1880 on up until 1907 or 8, and that's when they started the little clapboard building and built it. And in the meantime, after the congregation began to age and people had died off and moved away, they had sold the old rock building to 2 school teachers in Stephenville to preserve it, and they made it into a private residence. And it has sold 3 times totally, I think, and now under the Benson family.
Of course, it's been, 20 years. Does that couple that, the young, she's got dark hair?
Yeah.
She still lives in there?
They still live there, yeah, Steve Benison. Mr. Ed Benison owned it, his dad, and he passed away several years ago now, and Steve and his wife still live there.
Still live there.
Yeah.
I know they took a bunch of us through it, and school kids went and they were fascinated with that building.
Yeah, it has so many old memories, and for so many years after it was abandoned as a school in the late 1930s. I think mid-1930s, R.B. Carraway told me, the classes got down to where there were just a very few, and it was combined with Tolar and abandoned, and I have pictures from early, probably 1942, 1943, showing that the windows are empty and it's been abandoned for a while. But people would come down there to visit, and the first thing they did was go into that old rock building and tour it, or they would go down to the old bridge, and have their happy memories and take pictures. And even though the property was deeded, away from the church and all, it was like, hey, my ancestors built it, we still own it. We still want to go into it, and we still want to visit. And I think that happened several times to a couple of the owners, and that was when they eventually built a fence around it to keep people out. But they had to, because if they were off working, people would just go down there and go in, and they weren't supposed to do that. But they felt like it belonged to them because their family had been there forever.
Sure.
And but anyway, Steve and his wife still are there. Yes.
They've lived there a long time.
They have, and they're getting, they still travel, I think, some with the work they do with different nuclear plants. They both worked at the nuclear plant at Glenrose, and then now they've traveled to other areas and other sites with whatever type of work they do. So they're gone a lot, and most of the time that's all locked up, where people can't get into it. And we all try to kind of look after it too. But anyway, because of the abandonment of that building, we decided we had to do something. Well, we met on a Sunday in December, and we had put a notice in the paper we were going to meet, and it was colder than heck, it was just freezing. And we decided to have a church service, and we had found someone to hold the service. Well, we had a church full of community people that came down. And it was so cold, we were under blankets, and Diane Martin, who is our treasurer, but also has a very good voice and sings, she was singing a song and standing by one of the windows, and she said while we were holding that service, her hair was blowing from the north wind. Oh gosh, it was that cold. Well, we decided we had to do something to stabilize the building. So we found a carpenter, Mr. Van Landingham over at Tolar, and he rebuilt all our windows just from the pattern of an old one. And
That's the time that you and I were out there.
That's right,
we
yeah.
were rebuilding the windows.
yeah, and we restored all
Those windows were laying out in the grass, the old ones.
Yeah,
They were tempting.
we restored the old windows, and not long after we got them all in, and all, I don't know who, somebody decided they'd be a vandal and they threw rocks through them. So we had the glass replaced, and then we had those windows that go over a protection like plastic or glass or plexiglass or something, and they look just like the windows. They're made to look just like them. And so we have all the new windows covered with that to protect it. We put in heating and air conditioning.
You didn't get rid of the potbelly stove, did you?
We are not ever going to get rid of that potbelly stove.
Thank you.
That's part of that religion, okay? The church will burn down around that old stove. No, Bill Jones, when he goes to church, he's in his late 80s, and he gets pretty cold nowadays, so he sits right by that potbelly stove. And James Lofton, who's on our board, he's really good at building good fires in that potbelly stove. So one of the other members' granddaughters commented, well, I don't know how we're going to make it if James isn't here, to build the fire in the stove. But no, we kept it, and so far we still have the old benches and everything in it. We did tear out the old fiberboard that was on the ceiling, and that woodpeckers had gotten into and punched holes in, and it had molded and mildewed and everything else. And so we tore all that down and put in a wooden ceiling. And it's really, really looked pretty, and it has given that church a wonderful sound, the music, and it resonates so much better because of that. It's made it really neat. We still have not done much with the floors, and the reason being, people track in so much.
Yeah.
We did redesign and build a new door and made it one door instead of two in the front, because the way the face of the building was, rain would come down and warp those doors, and they would rot out and everything, and they replaced them with metal doors that didn't look right. So Marvy Van Landingham designed us a beautiful door to go with the shape of the windows.
So is the marker on the congregation or on the building?
No, it's not on the congregation or the building, it's on the cemetery.
Okay.
It's named it a Texas Historical Cemetery.
Okay, that makes more sense because you changed the
We
building.
changed the outside of the building, and we did not think that we would be able to get a historical mark on that
It
building.
wouldn't,
And because it didn't have the original doors in it. And we might have if, but we couldn't keep the original doors. They would have had to have been rebuilt
anyway.
Yeah.
I didn't think about the cemetery, but you know, you could have gotten it on the congregation too.
We can, and we may go back and do that. And I think we probably ought to.
You really should.
And, but Diane, you know, I told you all that we went through to get the historical marker, and it took us almost 10 years to do it. Not because we didn't do our part on it. It was just the fact that the state of Texas had cut the budgets from 3 people in the marker division to 1, and then they decided to cut over a computer, and she had to input all of the waiting lists for the markers in, and there were like 129. I think we were the 129th one that were ahead of us, and then she had to look at each one of those and then go out and survey each one of those cemeteries herself, and then write all the people around the cemeteries to get their permission before they would even consider granting the marker. Yeah. And then they gave the permission for the marker, and then we had to order the marker. Well, in the meantime, Victor Smith, who had worked so hard on all that marker project, had retired from the Hood County Historical Commission, and so they appointed someone else, and we had gotten back, we had submitted what we wanted on the marker, and we had gotten it back for corrections or additions or whatever, and so we did the corrections on it, got that all ready, sent it back to the Hood County Commission to send it back to the Historical Commission, and the new person that they had appointed, they didn't know that job entailed work. And, you know, it was evidently an honorary degree in their mind, but our appointment, but it was not an honorary position. It was a full-time position of work if you really did it right. So anyway, they just sat on it. They never did anything with it, and it delayed us a whole year getting the marker order in to get it cast, to get it back to us. So anyway, it took us through all of that about 10 years. And we finally got it last May, and DC said, it's not going to sit here. I'm going to get this thing installed, and so where do we want it? And we decided it needed to be at the entrance of the cemetery where people could read it and close to the road. So we placed it there at the entrance. And if you're driving in, then you can stop and read it, yeah. But there are several people in that cemetery we might could get historical markers for too, because there's a whole group of men that came after about 1868, 69 during the Reconstruction period in the South that were all involved in the Civil War, and some of them in some of the same units. And they are buried there in that cemetery, and we have a pretty good population of Civil War graves there. One of the first ministers, Leander Painter, is buried there, and he served in the Civil War and has a Civil War marker on his grave now, but there's several others there that don't. But a lot of those came from Alabama and Georgia, that after Reconstruction got so bad and they came back home, all their property had been destroyed or confiscated, and taxes became so high they couldn't pay for it, and they just loaded up and came to Texas. So, and that's how one of my great-great-grandfathers got here. They came with the Civil War budget, and I was telling you the other day on the phone, you have to look at Hood County history in certain increments. You look at it as the first settlement in the area has to do with the Barnards putting the trading post in at close to George's Creek on the east side of the Brazos River and nearer to Glenrose. And they built the first settlements and stuff. People would come to that area or to that trading post, and then from there they would branch out and look for land. And they mostly went up the creeks because there was water and wood for their fires, and there were cedar posts, that they could use. There were trees for building cabins and stuff, and limestone they could quarry for chimneys and foundations and later for houses. And then they could also, they could make gardens and stuff down in the bottomland where the soil was better than it was up on the hillsides. So anyway, but a lot of the first settlers that came were herdsmen. They brought their cattle with them, and they were herdsmen, or they acquired cattle on the range that were already roaming free in this area, and there were a lot of wild horses and stuff in the area. And so they came looking for places to put their herds and to be able to spread out and have land, and for them and for their families. And then when the Civil War occurs, part of the whole population then goes back further east because of the Indian raids. And then when they come back, they still are herdsmen, but when Reconstruction starts in the South, there's a migration that starts from the South and from the Missouri, Illinois area, and Tennessee, and they start coming across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, into Texas, and there are probably about 3 really main routes that they come in. And these people are bringing their cotton culture with them, and they're bringing industrial ideals from the North. And then the railroads come in. And so you have increments. The railroads bring even more industry, even more people in. And the obsolete early settlers, log cabins and the old mill and things like that become obsolete with the railroads coming in and bringing in more supplies. And then you have, by 1900, a more settled population in the area, a heavier population because of in-migration, but also because of the families having more children and looking for land. And so then you start seeing an out-migration of those people going further west. And when the cotton culture came in, a lot of the herdsmen went further west. So you're looking at several increments. The Meeks, the Walters, the Aston families, the Caraways, the Pates, the Jones, that came here and stayed, they were early herdsmen, all of them. And they bring a lot of family members. The Glenn family comes in. And there's another whole story about Mr. Glenn buying land that was first owned by my great-great-grandfather Osborne that I need to tell you. But anyway, there's these people are coming in and are a second migration of input into the history of Hood County. So we have to look at all of that, and then as the mill season ends in 1908, then you start seeing a much more educated population, because you've got schools, you've got little colleges that have sprung up, and you have a different whole group of people who are looking for opportunities, and they don't want to stay on the farm anymore, and so they start migrating out to your cities. And a lot of people went to Fort Worth and Dallas, a lot of people went west and ended up in, Mexico and California and different areas. But anyway, it's interesting when you start looking at the migration patterns of how they came and how your family history ties in with all that when you start looking at it. So, do you all have any, let me tell you the story about Mr. Osborne. And this is early, this is 1856. Grandpa Osborne lived in Gilmer County, Georgia, and the Jacksons, the Davis family from over around Market Mill, and several other families from that Gilmer County area all came to Texas and settled around Bluff Dale, Tolar, Rock Church, and on into Market Mill area out towards Lafayette. Okay, but Grandpa Osborne, in 1856, was accused of killing a slave in Gilmer County, Georgia. And so, I'm not sure it's 1856, it may have been a year or two before. He was seen in Dallas, Texas in 1856. But he flees Georgia and comes to Texas. And he brings with him James Franklin Wood. James Franklin was indentured to Newman Osborne as an illegitimate child when he was about 8 years old. We think he was a relative of Newman's. He wasn't one of Newman's children, an illegitimate child of Newman. He was from a cousin, I believe, of the Wood family. But anyway, the woman's name was Leeper, who was his mother. And in the old Osborne Bible, it had James Franklin Leeper, and then somebody had erased it and wiped it out and put Wood. And it probably, by the time they found out who his real dad was, but he was first named as a Leeper, by his mother's name. Anyway, he brings James Franklin as his apprentice with him and helper. They're seen in 1856. There's a letter that was written back to North Carolina saying they were seen here. There was a tornado that came through Dallas, and it blew a piece of lumber through one of Osborne's horses and killed his horse. And this is written up and told about. Anyway, then in 1857, Andrew Jackson, who had married Mary Osborne, Newman's daughter, and Judith Harris Osborne, Newman's wife, Jeremiah Osborne and his family, who is Newman's son, and Sarah Elizabeth Osborne, who had married William Davis, all come to Texas in a wagon train and to where Newman is. They come to the Barnard's trading post and they kind of camp out there. And Mary Osborne, my great-great-grandmother, was pregnant when she got here and had a child just right after that. This is like in the fall of 1857. She dies in January of 1858, just a couple of months after the child was born. So probably childbed fever, camping out in a wagon, the long trip here, disgusted because she left a home in Georgia. You know how women feel. They come out here, there's nothing, and you're going to have to do all the work to get it done, But anyway, she passes away, and so Judith Harris Osborne and Newman helped raise Andrew Jackson and Mary's children. They settle on land up Glen Cemetery Road, close to where Glen Cemetery is. And Newman and Judith die in 1867, just at the end after the Civil War, and they're buried in what is now Glen Cemetery. Before it was Glen Cemetery. their graves are there. So they are some of the very earliest people that came in. I have a little story I've written up about him that I need to give you all.
I would.
But anyway, Newman Osborne and Judith Harris Osborne, his second wife, his first wife had died. This is Mary is his oldest child by Judith, and this is his second family. His first family, most of the children stayed in Gilbert County, Georgia. Anyway, they come out here and settle and build homes. Andrew Jackson at one time owned land that was part of the Nuts owned, and the Nuts family I think bought it, and he moved out to where Gideon Mills was the 1860 census taker for Erith County, and he took the census for the area that's Rock Church and Paluxy now. So when you look at it, it's signed by him, and he was from Florida. Anyway, he sells out his property to Andrew Jackson, and part of it into a Mr. Stokes, and he moves on further west. He's buried out around Big Springs, out in that area. But part of the Mills family stayed in this area too. Mr. Gideon Mills' son and son-in-law went out looking for horses that had strayed and were killed by Indians. And he goes out because they didn't come home and he couldn't find them. He goes out and looks for his son and son-in-law. And so he finds them. They've been shot through with arrows. The horses they were riding had been shot through with arrows. The Indians had absconded with the horse herd that they were looking for. And so Gideon goes looking for Indians after he brings his son back and his son-in-law and buries them. And he finds some Indians. He probably doesn't know whether it's the ones that killed his family or not. But he kills and scalps 3 Indians. And he brings them back to that same cemetery where he buried his son and his son-in-law. But first he hangs them in trees until they become, just skeletons, and then he buries them. I'm telling y'all some gruesome stuff, but this is what happened. Anyway, the old cemetery, we call it the Dunnigan or Jackson Cemetery, because there's Wood, Jackson, and Dunnigans that are buried in it. Was on this place that the Gideon Mills owned it was actually a strip of land between him and the Baker family. The Baker Crossing Road's named after on the property there. And this is just a little bit on towards Bluff Dale, on the lower road to Bluff Dale from Rock Church. So anyway, he sells the land, and Andrew Jackson settles there with his children. And in the meantime, he marries Nancy Ingley, who is a widow. Her husband died right after they came to this part of the country, and so she's a widow, and he marries her. And she helps him raise his children, and they have one more child between them. Anyway, Judith Harris Osborne and Newman after they had died, their family in Georgia wanted their part of the estate from Newman. And so they sent Mr. Glenn down to look at and appraise the property here in Texas before they can settle the estate. And I don't know, he may have still owned property in Georgia, but anyway, Mr. Glenn comes and he makes the trip, and there's not much up this way. When Mr. Glenn came out in the 1870s, there still wasn't a whole lot of stuff around. And so anyway, he appraises the property, he loves the area, goes back and sells property he owns in Georgia, and buys the land that Newman owned from all the heirs in Georgia, and comes back here and purchased it from William Davis, who's married to Sarah Osborne, who is the executor of the state in Texas. So he purchases the land and eventually gives the land for Glen Cemetery. But the early history back 1850s, 1860s, this all took place. So that gives you a very earlier group of families that got here that early. So those are the histories that I found and they have unearthed in my little journey through Hood County. So anyway, I thought maybe you all might like to have that little bit of information.
Oh, yeah.
And the Glens then married into the Nutt family. So.
Everybody married into the Nutt family somewhere along the
Or the
line.
big family. Or the Caraways.
Yes. Well, anything that, I mean, your story today is wonderful. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we're really interested in here.
You don't have it written down anywhere. None of this is written down.
No.
It's in bits and pieces of family lore that have either been told to me or that I have found in reading or research all over the state of Texas and Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and Missouri. So it's very scattered, but the early settlers came from very good stock and they were very sturdy and they lived a long time. And Grandpa Meek tended to his cattle all the way through his 90s, and he fell off his horse about 1890, I mean, when he was about 95 or 96 years old. And he didn't die until he was 97. He lived another year after he fell off his horse. So, and one of his daughters said if he hadn't fallen off his horse, he'd lived to be 100.
Still. But all of the families and the picture, especially pictures that we can, use as displays would be.
What I'm thinking, we need to put together, and I want to brainstorm with you guys. I'm wondering if we could do a picture book of the early Paluxy and Rock Church history, and it just